Isn't it time you got an update?
Up next, we'll air remarks by Silvia Brucan, a political leader from Romania, about the current situation in his country. He speaks at a briefing held by the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Good afternoon. Let me welcome you to CSIS. I'm Steve Sostanovich, the director of our Soviet and East European Studies program. The center is often in a position to make available our facilities to important political figures of the day, to share their views and understanding of contemporary events with members of the press, with and the corporate and research communities in Washington. Today we're glad to be able to do this for Mr. Silvio Brucan, who will address us on recent events in Romania. Students of Eastern Europe have often played with the term differentiation, by which they showed a sophisticated awareness that all the countries of Eastern Europe are different. Last fall tended to both to undercut and to reiterate the importance of this term. It seemed for a while as though differentiation might be an unnecessary concept because in the twinkling of an eye, all the states of this region were suddenly moving in the same direction. It seemed away from the communist order that had prevailed for many years. As the dust begins to settle, of course, we realize that, in fact, differentiation has a great deal to commend. Commends itself to us in many ways. These countries are now taking very different directions, and it is important to understand the particular course, the particular factors that will determine the course of each one of them. To introduce Mr. Brucan, I'm happy to call on my colleague Edward Lutvak, who is not only the holder of the Burke Chair in Strategy at CSIS and the author of many books on international politics and military affairs, but he comes from a long line of Transylvanian toothpaste makers. So he's uniquely positioned to provide an introduction for our guest and speaker this afternoon. We will hear from Edward and then Mr. Brucan, at which point I will manage, I hope effectively, a question and answer session in which you will have the opportunity to put your questions to Mr. Brucan. Edward.
I come from Transylvanian dentifrice manufacturers, not toothpaste makers. Anyway, as well as other things, Sostanovich. Our speaker, Mr. Brucan, was born in Bucharest in 1916 under the sound royal government of those days. Was educated in the Bucharest University between the wars. Philosophy. Bucharest University was quite a serious educational establishment. He joined the underground movement in 1939 against the king's government, it would be later the Antonescu government and so on. You might call moderate fascists, a contradiction in terms, because he was a party member before 23 August 1944, when the Russian army arrived, and the enthusiasm of Romanians for the Communist Party increased very suddenly. His ostensible job, or at least formal job, and in fact professional job, was as acting editor of Scânteia. Scânteia was the Pravda of Romania, the important newspaper of Romania, the official newspaper of the Communist Party in 1944, and then of course the official party newspaper when the communists took over in December 47 or January 48. He was acting editor because the editor of Scânteia was a Politburo member who did not know how to read and write, and so you had to have somebody else who did know how to read and write, and that was Silvio Brucan. He was also a speechwriter, writer of important speeches, formal statements for George Dej and for leadership time, and a foreign affairs consultant and so on. In that capacity, he, not consultant, but advisor, that capacity, for example, he accompanied George Dej on trips to Soviet Union to meet Stalin. In 1955, he came to Washington as ambassador, served for 4 years, then went on 3 years to New York, where he was the permanent representative to the UN, the ambassador to the UN, so to speak. And then in 1962, became chairman of Romanian Radio TV. In 1964, I met Mr. Brucan in Bucharest, along with Dan Shore. Dan Shore was then the big-time CBS correspondent, and my job was, I obtained my assignment because I was the only one who could lift the very heavy camera of the Mitchell, the very heavy battery of the Mitchell camera. So. I was a camera carrier, and I met a few people, I guess. 1965, Mr. Brucan left the job in Romanian television and so on. That, coincidentally or not coincidentally, of course, was the time of transition from George Dej to Ceausescu. I should also point out that 64 and 65 were the years when the Romanian economy was doing extremely well. Rapid growth and development and so on. There was a lot of shiny new things to be seen around. Foreign Western technology, the government had opened to the West. There were French technology, other Western technology coming in important factories. Although there were already other aspects of the situation, such as enormous investment in the classic Stalinist-type steel combinat in Galați and other of these huge industrial complexes, which were based on this wrong notion of supply-side economics, which we all know is wrong. He then became professor of political science at the University of Bucharest, where he would obviously, he was the head of the cathedra, a real professor, not an American professor, assistant, whatever, but professor of the cathedra. He had the whole thing and so on. So he was the one who was teaching the, obviously, Marxist-Leninist doctrine, but of course in a broader context of political science. In fact, at that point, he became known to a different sort of audience, and the people who knew him as ambassador to Washington at the UN, because he published many articles, published books. 4 of them published in English. They're available. They can be purchased. They're published by Normal, Macmillan, Prager, and so on. He came into competition with us scribblers, but we don't mind. Now, in fact, he's on the verge of publishing a new book. The format of its publication is an extremely contemporary one, because the book, whose title is Pluralism and Social Conflict in the Communist World, this book will be published simultaneously by Prager and by Progress Publishers. Prager's and Progress, 2 publishing houses which in the past had both had the reputation of being connected to the special organs now cooperating. In 1987, there was the first major break in the Romanian situation as seen by us people far away, just casual observers of the political scene. There were the riots in Brasov, big Transylvanian industrial city where there were, among other things, there was a truck plant and various other things. And there were riots by workers, we were told. And then we were told by the press that they were repressed. And at that point, Mr. Silvio Brucan made a public statement to the BBC and UPI, a statement that was carried all over the world at that time, protesting the repression of the workers and describing the Brasov riots as a watershed in post-war Romanian political history because it was the first open break between the Communist Party and the workers. The result of this statement, a lot of us make statements to the press, you guys in the press carry them. The consequences are usually oblivion or sometimes individuals complaining. In his case, the consequences were house arrest, telephone cut off, mail cut off, and the isolation that descends on an individual who makes himself unpopular with authorities in a government where everybody is afraid of the authorities. The Ceausescu regime did not, in fact, go in for violent forms of repression. It was a very sophisticated type of repression. The motto of Ceausescu was no martyrs. This was not the primitive sort of Idi Amin type of thing. This was a sophisticated type of repression in the finest traditions of Ottoman and Byzantine sort of statecraft. But when somebody is placed under house arrest and so on, he also loses the connection with most of the people who would have called themselves his friends, who can't afford to be seen to show any sympathy for him. In March 1989, he drafted the more famous, in fact, generally known, open letter of the Six, signed by prominent old-time communists, such as himself, including two former secretaries generals of the party, and Minister Berladiano, that Dan Shore and I both knew at the time, and many Americans know because he was Minister of Foreign Trade. What? Foreign Affairs, yes. And Foreign Trade. And Foreign Trade before that. The result of this open letter was that he was invited in by the gentlemen of the Securitate, and who no doubt asked him questions, perhaps not very politely. He was held for 2 months. Then he was evicted from his house, and of course, an all-time Communist Party member who had held such important positions would have had an elegant, commodious sort of apartment downtown Bucharest, or maybe even a house or something. He was evicted, and he ended up in a shack on the outskirts of Bucharest. This all being, of course, last year. A shack which was had no water, gas, or other unnecessary frills at all. And there he remained until December 22nd, when he immediately became an automatic member of the National Salvation Front. What happened from December 22nd to the present is, in its own way, another dramatic story, but that will no doubt come out in the questions and answers. I would like to say just 2 words about generics. First, Romania is a country that is little known in the United States, and when known adversely. It has something of a reputation of my own native Transylvania. And of course, I always love to think that the Transylvania reputation is well deserved. It helps a lot in my business as a defense advisor. People really feel that if you're Transylvanian, you know how to get rid of people. The fact of the matter is that the claim that Romania has, that there's a Latin element in Romanian culture, is a claim that I think, can be validated by casual acquaintance. There is a Latin, I think, a cultural substrata. It lends a certain humanity to Romanian life. It lends other Mediterranean qualities to Romanian life that I personally find very appealing. It is a country which has in the past done very well, in fact, as a power in the contemporary world. Romania came out of the First World War greatly expanded. It is a country which has known its good moments, it's known its bad moments, and now has an entire new phase open before it. Another word about the Communist Party of Romania. Of all countries in Eastern Europe, Romania is the one that had the most insignificantly small Communist Party. That was partly, of course, the stage of development to Romania with relatively little industry. The communists who were, the people like Silvia Brucan who joined the Communist Party were, you might say, the most progressive elements of society. They were, in fact, idealists. My family, my father would have always knew a lot of these people. They thought that they were misguided idealists and that the theory was entirely wrong and it would lead to dictatorship and so on. The fact of the matter is that they were idealists when they joined. All they could expect when they joined, they were not offered villas and privileges and cars and drivers. They were offered the possibility of a dangerous existence at best and imprisonment at worst, or worse than imprisonment. So what we have here is the transition from idealism to hope, to government activity, and to the whole kermesse of this generation. So I'm very pleased to introduce our guest. He was kind enough to telephone me when he arrived in New York, and I immediately invited him. He was somewhat hesitant. He accepted. I'm glad he's here. Silvio, can we begin?
Ladies and gentlemen, the issue that troubles you most these days, as much as I can read your mind, is whether the process of change initiated in Moscow and Eastern Europe is irreversible or not. This is my subject today. Since we are dealing here with predictions, I must mention to you some of my credentials in this respect. In 1987, in my book published by Prager, I wrote in the preface, and I quote, "This book was prompted by the prospect I envision that unless socialist societies of the East adapt their system to the scientific technological revolution, at least to the extent that the West already has, socialism will remain caught in the 20th century and will remain a historical phenomenon of the past." Unquote. And last but not least, in the International Herald Tribune, September 3, 1987, I concluded my article with the following prophetic sentence, and I quote again, by 1990, a new political generation will be in command all over Eastern Europe, unquote. Indeed, Solidarity's victory in the Polish elections, the upheaval in East Germany that toppled Erich Honecker and brought Hans Modrow to power. What followed was a change of guard in Czechoslovakia, with Václav Havel as new president, and Todor Zhivkov's fall in Bulgaria, replaced by Peter Mladenov. As we were approaching in Romania the end of 1989, I began to fear that my prediction will fall short of fulfillment. But on December 22nd, only 9 days before the deadline, a popular explosion in Bucharest forced the dictator Ceausescu to run away, and the National Salvation Front took over power. At last, we did it. Having established my credentials, let me deal now with my last prediction: the dissolution of the Communist Party in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. The Western press has widely analyzed the economic and political causes of that phenomenon. Today and here, I propose to go to the bottom line. Its social causes, its social background in a historical perspective. Why is the social? Why is the social? Because the social is the most stable and the most enduring facet of the historical process. In the economy, you have crises, mostly unexpected, such as the fall or rise of the dollar, stock market in Tokyo or New York, remember the Black Monday, drop in oil prices or in the rate of the dollar, etc., etc. Political developments are equally sometimes unexpected. Elections like Nicaragua, or the death of a strong leader, say Stalin or Roosevelt, with enormous political consequences. Not so with the evolution of social forces. They look like the slow but continuous flow of a large river. Social developments are seldom affected by unexpected crises. Just think of Middle America, which has been with us for more than half a century, signifying the basic fact that we are dealing with the largest middle class in the history of capitalism. The enduring character of the class structure is equally valid in the East, perhaps even more so. The 1917 October Revolution was a singular historical event. It changed Russia's political system overnight, and very soon its economic system was equally overhauled. Not so its social forces. The reality of millions of peasants dominating Russia's social landscape will remain a crucial factor in Soviet society for a long time to come. Eventually, it was a peasantry that provided the human resources to fill the missing link of Lenin's grand revolutionary design, the industrial proletariat. Therefore, when we now ask whether the process of change in the East is irreversible or not, economists and political scientists are forced to qualify their answers with all kinds of ifs. If that will happen, if that will happen, and so on. They cannot predict. It is only the slow but powerful flow of the social river that can more reliably tell us where the East is heading. Where and why went Karl Marx wrong? Marx's social assumption was that because of industrialization, an ever-increasing working class would take shape in post-revolutionary society, a class sufficiently integrated to share a common ideological consciousness and a common set of material and cultural interests. And of course, Marx anticipated that the proletariat would become the ascendant and dominating class in society after the revolution, on the ground that the proletariat will become the embodiment of the emerging new productive forces of industrialism. Those were the social assumptions upon which Vladimir Ilyich Lenin built his theory on the Communist Party as a vanguard of the proletariat, and the same social assumptions were invoked by Stalin to proclaim and legitimize the leading role of the Communist Party in a socialist society. The scientific technological revolution has invalidated all these assumptions and theories one by one. I wrote a whole book about this that was mentioned before, and that will soon be published in New York and Moscow. Here I will only make some historical points. To begin with, the social structure of 1917 Russia was so bewilderingly different from Marx's sociological model that we can well understand why Soviet historians and sociologists did not dare, or were not permitted to dare, to write about it. Lacking the social agent of change, the proletariat, which had been decimated in the revolution and in the Civil War, the Bolshevik Party, once in power, could not operate in a vacuum. It had to rely more and more on the state apparatus to consolidate its position and enforce its policies. Under Stalin, the party bureaucracy merged with that of the state, thus shaping the ruling social group wielding power in the USSR. It took some time before industrialization generated a massive exodus of peasants to the cities to join the industrial labor force. This is how the new working class was created. From the beginning, the Communist Party consistently courted the new workers. providing them with conditions of urban life, which, however difficult, were incomparably better than the idiocy of rural life they left behind. Career and educational opportunities without precedent opened up for millions of uprooted peasants entering the new industrial plants. The industrial worker of peasant origin, became the ideal social base for the Communist Party. Incapable of exercising power himself in a modern industrial society, the peasant turned worker makes it necessary for a vanguard to exercise power on his behalf. He brought with him a village tradition with no urge for organization. Political expression seemed to him superfluous. Neither was freedom of the press the dream of illiterates. In other words, his political culture makes him the perfect object of the revolution from above. In its turn, the ruling party bureaucracy acquired perfect ideological credentials and political legitimacy on the premise that the regime is based upon and devoted to the true industrial workers who builds socialism with his own hands. This mutually rewarding arrangement has been totally upset by the scientific technological revolution. This revolution has affected production processes, social structures, and all spheres of human life much more deeply than all social and national revolutions of our time. The scientific technological revolution actually diminishes the number, social status, and prestige of the manual worker, while increasing the number of intellectuals and enhancing their status and role in society. It was a perception of this underlying social effect of the technological revolution that prompted Brezhnev to resist its assimilation in the civilian industrial process. All available data show that in all Western countries, a series of scientific breakthroughs in the 60s began to be incorporated on a large scale into industrial technology, resulting in a considerable expansion of productive forces. The United States was leading the way, followed by the West German and Italian miracles in the 60s, and by the record-breaking achievements of Japan in the 70s and early 80s. Even moderately industrialized countries like Spain and Greece jumped 8 to 10% in economic growth once they introduced the new technologies in their industrial process. Precisely at this point, the Soviet Union and all Eastern European countries experienced a sharp decline in their rates of economic growth, from 10% in 1960 to 3% in the early 80s. Why should the socialist states experience such a sluggish rate of growth at the time when the task set by the Soviet Communist Party was to fuse the discoveries of the scientific technological revolution with the advantages of the socialist economic system. By now, we know the economic reason of that drop. The command-type planning system initiated by Stalin is lacking flexibility and provides no incentives for the innovation of the productive process. Moreover, it is too centralized and heavy-handed for adapting to rapid technological change. What we don't know is the social reason of Brezhnev's stagnation period. What was the social braking mechanism made of, and how did it work? To find the answer, I examined the wage policy of the USSR and Eastern European countries. Since the National Wage Fund is limited, its mechanism is regulated by a zero-sum game. One group's gain is the other's loss. Hence, a conflict of interest between manual workers on the one hand and engineers and specialists on the other broke out in all socialist countries, with a differential in wages reflecting vacillations in class policy. In the 60s, as part of Khrushchev's reforms and his cultural thaw, the differential in favor of engineers and specialists rose to 48% in industry and 55% in construction. In the Brezhnev era, policies shifted back in favor of manual workers, resulting in a reduction of that differential to a mere 10%, and in some industries, the average earnings of workers topping those of engineers. In retrospect, we now realize that the Brezhnev leadership refused to sacrifice the preeminence of the industrial worker on the altar of the technological revolution and to grant the intelligentsia the leading social position in society which that revolution required. The conservative backlash in the cultural and artistic life of the 70s was the other dimension of that basic class policy. What is more, Brezhnev called time and again for the reproletarization of the Communist Party, and even tried to steer young people to vocational and technical schools rather than to universities. It looks as he was trying to raise a sort of rampart to defend the system against the technological revolution. The fact is that in the late 70s, when in all advanced nations the share of manual workers was dropping sharply, in the USSR, Brezhnev succeeded to make them grow by 3% annually. Throughout Eastern Europe, the Communist parties followed the same pattern. In the mid-60s, even in the industrial developed Czechoslovakia, the differential between the wages of engineers and those of manual workers was a mere 27%. A researcher with a university diploma could only match the wage of a worker in the machine tool industry when he was 46, 47 years old, a physician only when he was 52, 53 years old. The anti-intellectual policy was also evident in the fact that only 29% of those occupying top executive positions were college graduates, despite the high level of education in Czechoslovakia. Indeed, the issue at stake in the 1968 Prague Spring was much deeper than we thought, involving in the last analysis the very character of class power in the Eastern Bloc. All these findings let me take a look at the international social statistic. Up to now, we measured the East-West competition only in economic terms. What we found is that in the 70s, the social gap, not only the economic gap, the social gap between the two also got wider. In the West, the technological revolution accelerated three major social processes. Labor force in agriculture was drastically reduced, industrial workers diminished substantially, while employment in services increased rapidly. In the East, the above-mentioned policies slowed down all three processes: the preservation of the social structure turning into a retarding factor of national development. The crisis of the Communist Party. With the coming to power in Moscow of a new generation, the Soviet Union was moving in a new direction. The three major objectives of reform, perestroika, glasnost, democratizatia, testify to Gorbachev's awareness that change must affect not only the economy, but social relations and the Communist Party itself. The 27th Congress emphasized that mechanization, automation, and computerization will sharply reduce the share of manual labor, which by the year 2000 will be reduced to 15–20% of the total workforce. At the same time, the role of scientists and technologists will increase considerably. There are already signs of change in this respect. The differential in wages in favor of the intellectuals has been raised to 80%. In general, the USSR is now going through its most impetuous upsurge in science, culture, and arts. The technical and creative intelligentsia is in the forefront of the battle for reform, marching on the road to power. Such a radical transformation of Soviet society could not but encounter fierce resistance among the social groups most affected by it. The mass of manual workers, about 30% of the workforce, who are losing their social status and prestige. The party bureaucracy, with its administrative apparatus, about 15% of the workforce, trying to hold on power and privileges. And finally, the Stalinist ideologues, the last Mohicans, clinging to the key position they still hold in cultural institutions. But manual workers are fewer, many responding to the new incentives to raise their qualification. The latter two groups are political species endangered by reform measures. Indeed, all three are social groups without a future. They can surely obstruct and retard the process, but they cannot stop it. Actually, Khrushchev's reform failed precisely because these three groups were still going strong in the early 60s. The real difficulty now is to dislodge the social structure resulting from the collusion of the three groups, which was consolidated in the 70s through the consensus-building policies of Brezhnev, a structure that still generates the conservative spirit permeating Soviet society and, to a large extent, the Communist Party itself. What about the working class today? In October 1986, a Moscow scientific conference revealed that its definition is simply missing. Here are the conclusions of my own analysis. 1. The scientific technological revolution has virtually destroyed the notion of working class as a large, compact sociological unity. Such a class no longer exists in social reality. 2. The dialectic of social development in socialism is such that instead of homogenization, we witness a process of social differentiation, both in the urban, industrial, and rural agricultural environments, a process to be widened by reform. The socio-occupational groups that emerge range from unskilled and skilled manual workers to engineers and specialists, white-collar functionaries and state administrative personnel, creative intellectual professionals, service employees, private artisans and repairmen, cooperative workers and entrepreneurs, etc. The concept of class is becoming totally inadequate to deal with such diverse and very often conflicting categories. Therefore, today, the socio-occupational group is a concept much more fertile than class for the study of society. This concept allows for empirical inquiries of social differentiations in terms of economic status, cultural level, value orientation, and consciousness. Finally, the new class alignment has led to a crisis of the Communist Party itself. The question was whether the party could reshape its conception and structure so as to absorb and accommodate in the political sphere the various interests of the social groups described above, particularly those of intellectuals. The issue was discussed candidly at a seminar last May in the Soviet Siberian city of Novosibirsk, entitled Perestroika, Who is in Favor and Who is Against? Examining the results of a 6-year inquiry led by the Soviet sociologist Tatiana Zaslavskaya, the seminar concluded: manual workers are against. Skilled workers support democratization but not economic change. Intellectuals and political leaders are in favor of both. Bureaucrats and the administrative apparatus oppose radical reform. Managers of enterprises support economic change but not political change. Now, where and how are these major social groups going to express their views? In a socially differentiated society, political pluralism is a must if violent social eruptions and clashes are to be avoided and economic activities are to follow an ascending line. In recent times, Gorbachev has often mentioned socialist pluralism. But what exactly is it? There are only two possible types: a multi-party system or pluralism within a one-party system. However, party pluralism means renouncing the monolithic conception that has made the Communist Party intolerant, repressive, and bureaucratic. This means the acceptance and legalization of groups and factions within the party, the only way of making it democratic and representative. In fact, factions did exist and will always exist in a socially differentiated society with a one-party system. Even after the 10th Congress of the Bolshevik Party in 1921, which at Lenin's proposal adopted the resolution forbidding them, factions continue to exist, with leftist and rightist platforms clashing in the party and in public. Subsequently, one faction, be it Stalin's, Khrushchev's, Brezhnev's, and now Gorbachev's, has invariably run the party by eliminating the other. It is monolithism, the denial of the right of various social groups to be represented, that has made the Communist Party repressive within and without. The fact is that if the constituent parts of society do not and cannot defend their interests and express their views in the only party that exists, then the emergence of alternative political party is not only inevitable, but perfectly legitimate. That is exactly what is happening throughout Eastern Europe today. Moreover, the principal social effect of the technological revolution has pushed the intelligentsia to the forefront of society. We are thus dealing with a social stratum that cannot possibly come to terms with an intolerant and repressive political machinery. In addition, the ideal social base of the Communist Party, the manual workers of peasant origin, is a dwindling social stratum, diminishing both in numbers and social status. In the age of computers and information society, the manual worker can hardly be described as the embodiment of the most advanced productive process. Hence, a legitimate question arises. How can the Communist Party possibly remain the leading political force in society as a party of a class that is losing ground socially and embodying obsolete productive forces economically? Here is the crux of the matter. The change in the social landscape is a basic reason why the Communist Party is doomed to extinction. The sooner communist leaders recognize the historical limits of their party, the better, as we see today throughout Eastern Europe. The revolution in Romania, because of its violence and radical nature, has revealed more clearly and more obviously than in any other Eastern European country the social and historical anachronism of the Communist Party as a type of political organization in modern times. It was the only revolution in which the Communist Party did not participate at all, the revolution that turned from the very beginning against the Communist Party. Ceausescu's totalitarian system was not only very brutal, but also very effective. No opposition group could ever take shape either within or without the Communist Party. Therefore, Romanians identify the party with Ceausescu's crimes and abuses of power. Even in the Soviet Union, the Communist Party has been apparently unable to play the vanguard role required by Gorbachev's revolutionary breakthrough. In fact, Gorbachev's shock brigade in changing Soviet society is not the Communist Party, but the intelligentsia, particularly the Russian intelligentsia. All this prompted the February plenary meeting of the Soviet Communist Party to eventually agree on A, the elimination of Article 6 of the Constitution regarding the leading role of the Communist Party, and B, the principle of a multi-party system in the USSR. This opens up a new page in the political life of the USSR. Whether the two factions taking shape, the one led by Igor Ligachev and the other led by Boris Yeltsin, will remain within the party or will develop into alternative political parties is still a big question mark. Hence, my general conclusion is that because of the social differentiation taking place in all societies in the East, the predominance of political pluralism and the multi-party system is a safe prediction. Thank you, gentlemen. And ladies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brucan, Professor Brucan, Ambassador Brucan. I'm
Just
sure you...
as Kissinger used to say, just call me Excellency.
Excellency. I'm sure you'll understand if many of the questions focus in particular on events in Romania. I have some of my own, but I think I will let the audience speak first. Let me say we have a roving mic here, and so if the questioners will wait for it to arrive before they speak, then everyone will be able to hear. Let me ask you also to identify yourselves. The first questions are over there, John.
Dr. Brucan, I'm Henry Rosen, the Washington Inquirer.
I cannot hear you.
Just hold it close. I'm Henry Rosen.
Speak louder.
Washington Inquirer. In 1946, you voted for the death penalty, which sentenced many democratic elements to death. And since then, you have been described by some people as a Stalinist. Do you repent for having done that now? And also, how do you identify yourself politically today?
You said in 1956?
1946.
First, that is not true. It's a big lie. I never advocated death penalty. And since it's a big lie, I cannot answer.
The second part of the question was how you identify yourself politically today.
I would identify myself politically as a radical thinker of the left. A radical thinker of the left.
Next questions, down here, John.
Excellency, it has been reported in the Romanian press that you are indeed the Stalinist element in the National Salvation Front, that you have organized the counter demonstrations against the demonstrations which are held by the democratic political parties. After hearing your Marxist-Leninist discourse and apologies of Marxist-Leninism, perhaps you'll care to comment on contemporary Romania, on the existing problems in Romania, problems which you yourself are contributing greatly to. Are you, as it is requested of you in Romania, planning to perhaps point to the plots and crimes committed throughout the communism dictatorship in Romania, and perhaps step down and give the Romanian people a break in order to consolidate the democratic institutions in Romania?
Ladies and gentlemen, I am used in Bucharest with such planted questions. I did expect in New York, in Washington, but probably the network is larger than I thought. I have the impression that my presentation was sufficiently clear to answer this kind of question, and I don't feel the need of adding anything to it.
Next question over here. Would the questioners identify themselves, please?
Suzanne Sternthal from Insight Magazine. Given what you said, the fact that the workers are the ones that are most opposed to the various reforms that are taking place in the Soviet Union toward greater glasnost, perestroika, and demokratia, could you explain, please, why is it that the National Salvation Front seems to be mostly supported by the workers rather than the students and the intellectuals?
That's a good question. The first one that is not planted. First of all, in Romania, we don't have a sociological system of polling public opinion, so that the premise on which your question is based is debatable. But in general, it appears that you are right. Indeed, the massive reaction of workers to the attempts that were made in Bucharest to penetrate by force into our headquarters is a very convincing argument in favor of your thesis. At the same time, everybody who is familiar with the Romanian intellectual landscape knows that in the present government there are some of the most brilliant minds of the Romanian intelligentsia. I think the elections will show to what extent your assertion is correct or not. I consider that the very fact that the front has really opened up the way for the creation of a civil society in Romania. The fact that the front, which was the only political force in the country for the first 2 weeks, is responsible for the beginning of a democratic life in Romania. The fact that we have now newspapers which are attacking almost every day the leaders of the front, and I am one of their favorite targets. The very fact that they can publish such harsh criticism is the evidence that we are beginning to have a democratic life in Romania. Therefore, I think that Even the intellectuals who were at times critical of some of the real mistakes committed by the front, even they will, when the real choice will have to be made on the election day, even they will consider that if Romania is to have its way to a real modern democracy, they will also favor to a large part the front in the elections.
We have another question over here, John.
My name is András Domány. I am a National Forum Foundation visiting fellow from Hungary. And you will understand, therefore, that one of my questions is whether it's possible to avoid that ancient, traditional nationalistic hatred which is unfortunately present between our nations, whether it will be possible to improve this situation of the Hungarian minority in Romania, giving them their minority rights in a democratic country. The other question is, taking into consideration what you have told, that this Ceausescu regime was so cruel that there was no underground movement or opposition like in other socialist countries, so-called socialist countries. What do you think, whether there are personalities in the new opposition parties, non-former communists, because some of the leaders, you for example, are accused of being former communists, whether there are former communists who are able to be leaders of a country, and whether it's true that the new parties, which are virtually new versions of old Romanian parties, that they are democratic. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry that most of the questions have no relation whatever to my presentation, which means that those who came with those questions were prepared in advance, being ready to forget of what I said. I would have liked to have a substantial discussion on the questions I raised here, but since that is the situation, I will have to deal with the two questions you raised. The minority question is a very serious one in Romania, and I think that there is a radical change in the way it is now viewed compared with the forced assimilation that was Ceausescu's policy. I think that after the elections in Hungary, there will be a better chance to deal in a calm and positive way with that very sensitive issue. The second question, the fact is that we have now an organ of power in which political parties of the opposition participate. One of the vice presidents, Mr. Campiano, who belongs to the National Liberal Party, holds a very important position, and so does the other vice president, Professor Manzato, who is a leader of the Republican Party. In other words, we now have an organ with executive and legislative functions in which there is a form of power sharing. And I think that has been functioning very well lately. The provisional parliament, which is made up of about 45 political parties, its sessions are televised publicly, and there is a real discussion, there is a real exchange of views, and in my own opinion, we are going through the first elementary class of learning democracy.
John, I think there was a question over there in the corner.
John Delay, Washington Inquirer. The French magazine Le Point said that the Romanian Revolution of 1989 was organized by Moscow. Do you have any information on this?
The Romanian Revolution was 100% a spontaneous, popular explosion. I would have liked very much that this revolution would have a political party leading it. And of course, you know that modesty has no place in politics. If your supposition were true, we would have boasted, and our political legitimacy would have been much greater as the organizers of that revolution. But this is not the case.
Let me follow up on that question, if I might. A somewhat different reading, or somewhat different issue, is not whether the front was preparing a conspiracy over a long period, which I think looks somewhat unlikely, but whether or not the decisive moment in the fall of the Ceausescu regime was not so much the popular demonstrations, but the abandonment of Ceausescu by the army. It's very rare that a dictator of the type that you describe Ceausescu having been flees the capital after one demonstration. It's unusual. It suggests a lack of nerve, and we know he didn't. He had the ability to rule rather firmly. My conjecture would be that he saw things happening behind the scenes that were perhaps not visible to everyone else, that told him that his regime was crumbling from below. Could you comment on that, which isn't a question about a long-prepared conspiracy, but about a kind of palace coup, if you will?
No, sir, I don't agree with you, and I will tell you the facts. First of all, on December 21st, it was the first time that in a huge mass meeting, Ceausescu was booed by the masses for the first time. Second, the attitude of the army changed only in Bucharest, not in Timișoara. In Timișoara, the army fired on the people along the Securitate. This is a historical fact. The attitude of the army changed only because of the popular explosion. And only as a result of that popular explosion. So I think these are very convincing facts. Of course, later on the army played a decisive role in defeating the troops of Securitate, the whole contingency plan that was prepared by Ceausescu in case of a popular revolt. But the historical truth is that the attitude of the army changed only December 22nd as a result of the dimension of that popular explosion.
Dan Shore has the next question, and then Edward Luttwak.
Sylvia, we share a long-standing interest in television. How important, perhaps decisive, was the role of television in the revolution? If the control of television had remained in the hands of Ceausescu people, could it have gone differently?
Television was absolutely decisive. In fact, the television studio was our first strategic objective, and the television studio was their first strategic objective. On December 22nd, after we assembled for the first time, I'm talking now about the leaders of the front, we decided that our first objective strategic should be the television studio. And there was a huge march organized that took over the television studio eventually. But Sunday, December 24, it was an all-out attack that started at 6 o'clock in the morning of the Securitate forces upon the television studio. It started with grenades and incendiary bombs that practically destroyed 2 floors of the television building, and with an attack coming from 4 directions. And I can tell you, they would have taken it if the television studio were not surrounded by a mass of about 4,000 young people who stayed 3 days and 3 nights on a freezing temperature. It was 24 December, and in Bucharest it's very cold in December. They stayed for 3 nights and 3 days, and the Securitate forces could not penetrate that massive popular shield to take the television studio. They saved it. They saved it. This is the truth. So, for us, as well as for them, television was strategic objective number 1.
Who was us?
The front.
The last question from Edward Luttwak.
That's a heavy artillery.
No, no. I actually have a question on the body of your theory. But before that, I'd like to say, Silvio, since there are many old friends of yours here, that when Washington is not a great academic city. It is a great political city in which you were ambassador, in which you're well known as a public figure. So when people come here and ask questions, it doesn't mean that the questions are planted. When people come here and ask hostile questions, turning to you as a representative of a generation that controlled the fate of Romania during all these years, these questions may be rude, they may be inappropriate to the subject, but to say planted implies that there is some organism, an underground organism that sends people here. Silvio, since you're beginning a wave of visits to America, expect lots of questions. Some of them will be hostile, but it is unlikely that they will be planted. Just, the opposition, indeed, there is none. I have a legitimate question in terms of him. Your analysis is an analysis which has also been done by some other people. There was one of the first books published on Gorbachev, the very first book actually, published in the course of 1995 by Zemtsov, some unknown emigre in Jerusalem, was all based on this type of sociological analysis. I think it is a powerful analysis of the...
What's the name?
I think it's Zemtsov. He's a person of great obscurity, but he published the first book on Gorbachev within months, therefore not based on any biographics. It was all social analysis. It's a powerful analysis of what was the strength of the Communist parties in the 50s, the uprooted peasantry that becomes an industrial working class and so on. And it is a powerful analysis of downfall. How about applying it to China, which is still at the stage of development, where sort of classic industry is still on the increase, where you still have peasants moving to cities and moving to factories? Does that mean that the Chinese Communist Party could apply the straightforward Leninist formula and do well with it? And if so, why did they in fact acting the other way and appear to focus on essentially obtaining support from the peasantry at large by letting them out and all these other things? But more generally, apply the same mechanism, the same analysis to China, and rather to the Communist Party of China.
Well, I have a separate chapter in my book about China. First, I consider that in answering your question, you must start from the fact that China, compared with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, is one social stage behind. Even now, 80% of the population of China is in the countryside. And my analysis emphasizes the fact that one of the main features of Mao Zedong's policy was rather in favor of the peasantry, and the conflict with Liu Shaoqi had as an underlying reason the fact that Liu Shaoqi was advocating the Soviet model based on development of a large working class with industrialization. And Mao was against that. He tried to create he tried to create steel furnaces in the villages. Therefore, the whole conception of Deng Xiaoping is different from that of Gorbachev. Deng Xiaoping has remained, in fact, to the thesis that the dictatorship of the proletariat is not only a question of class, it's a question of political regime. Here is a distinction between Marx, who conceived the dictatorship of the proletariat as a class factor, whereas Stalin consider it as a question of political regime. And Deng Xiaoping is in favor of the latter. In addition to that, the intelligentsia in China is far from playing the same role and having the same weight as in the Soviet Union. Third difference, whereas in Gorbachev's conception, the modernization means computerization and information society, in Deng Xiaoping mind, modernization means industrialism. In other words, the stage behind socially is reflected in the stage behind economically. And I think these are the differences which the very fact that they can conceive the modernization of a country without intellectuals and without students, because that's what's in their mind now. But I give them no more than 1 year.
Really?
To the octogenarians of China who are now in power.
But according to the development of their society and economy, they could have another 30 years. In terms of your own analysis.
No, because
I hope your conclusion is correct.
Because their economy is in disarray.
Ah, I see. Very well. I want to thank you all for coming. Those of you who have any academic or analytical questions to ask of our speaker, he may be detainable here for a few more minutes. I want to recognize in the audience the new ambassador of Romania, Virgil Constantinescu, who's here. And I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.
That concludes this discussion on the current political and economic situation in Romania. For more information, you may write the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The address is 1800 K Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20006. Coming up after this short break, we'll air a discussion on upcoming East German elections.